It's okay. That's what my wife said the first time a stranger made fun of her scar. She has said those same two words her whole life. A long time ago, I decided she would never have to say them alone. We had just moved to a new neighborhood. My wife and I had been married for 25 years. We had one moving truck and a street full of people we didn't know yet. The neighbors invited us to a barbecue that Saturday. That morning, I watched Emma pick out her lipstick. She held up 3 different colors, trying to guess which one would draw less attention to her lip. "Maybe we should just skip it," she said. She wasn't really asking me. She put on the same thin gold necklace she always wears when she's nervous. She's worn it to every hard moment for 25 years. In the car, she asked, "Do you think first impressions ever stop mattering?" I smiled. "Only to people who don't stick around long enough for a second one." She laughed, softer than she meant. 2. I took her hand without saying anything else. We've done this 1,000 times. Here's something I never told anyone. On our 3rd date, way before any of this, Emma put down her fork and said, "You can ask me." "Ask you what?" I said. She touched her lip. "About my scar," I smiled. "Actually, I was just wondering if you'd let me order dessert." She laughed for real that time. It was the first laugh I ever got out of her. I never asked about the scar again. I didn't need to. I had already seen her, the real her. The barbecue started off easy. The couple next door introduced themselves before we even got out of the car. 2 kids asked if I liked baseball before they even asked my name. A little boy dropped his hamburger in the grass. Emma was already crouching next to him before his lip even started to wobble. "That happens to the best hamburgers," she told him, and made him a new plate before he could even feel embarrassed. An older man mentioned his name once in passing while pouring lemonade. 10 minutes later, Emma called him by that name like they'd known each other for years. He looked surprised, then pleased. When the paper plates started piling up, Emma was already gathering them without being asked, stacking them neatly so nobody had to think about the mess. By the time one guy walked over to us, everyone on the street already liked her. He clapped my shoulder. "You're a lucky man. A guy like you could have had anyone." He glanced at Emma. "Guess love really is blind." Nobody laughed. Then he laughed by himself, and it just hung there in the air, awkward. 5 seconds went by. Maybe longer. One woman quickly started talking about the weather. A teenage boy near the cooler laughed, then looked embarrassed that he'd laughed. An older woman looked down at her plate, like she felt bad for everyone. The kids by the sprinkler got quiet. Emma's hand went up to her lip. "It's okay," she said, quiet, like she'd said it 100 times before because she had. I took a breath. "Can I tell you something?" I asked the man. People started moving closer without really meaning to. Somebody turned the music down. "You're asking the wrong question," I said. He laughed, a little nervous now. "So what's the right one?" "If you'd met her on the worst night of my life," I said, "you'd have asked me something very different. When I was a kid, my brothers never said, 'Come play with us.' They said, 'Mom says we have to let you play.' Every Christmas, 3 stockings hung by the fireplace. Mine always hung a little bit apart from the other 2. My parents loved me completely. That was the only thing that made everything else okay. When they died, that little bit of distance turned into a real fight. One rainy night, I came home and found out the locks had been changed. My suitcase was already packed and sitting on the porch. My brother stood in the doorway. "This house belongs to family," he said. "I am family," I said. "No, you're not." He paused. It lasted long enough that I already knew what he was about to say. "You're adopted. There was a tree behind the house. My mom had planted it the year I joined the family. I reached out and touched it on my way past. Leave that too," he said. Porch light clicked off behind him. I looked around the yard. No one was pretending to eat anymore. The stranger's smile had disappeared. I stood on the curb, holding the one photo I had left of my parents. For 1 second, I almost let the rain take it, the same way it had taken everything else. I couldn't do it. I held on tighter instead. Cars kept driving by. Nobody stopped. Then headlights. Slowing down. Stopping. Emma didn't ask why I was standing in the rain. She looked at the soaked photo in my hands before she even looked at my face. Somehow that told her enough. She walked over slowly like she didn't want to startle me. "You're freezing," she whispered. She took off her own coat. I tried to hand it back. "You'll get cold," I said. "I'll survive." I shook my head. "Emma, Mark." That was all she said. Somehow she made my name sound like a place I still belonged. She wrapped the coat around my shoulders anyway. Then she bent down and picked up my suitcase like it weighed nothing. "You don't even know what happened," I said. She smiled. "You'll tell me when you're ready." She opened the passenger door. "Come home." Her apartment was small. It only had one chair. She searched every cupboard in the kitchen before she found what she had. "I only have tomato soup," she said, almost apologizing. "I'm not hungry," I said. She made it anyway. She cut the grilled cheese into triangles. I hadn't told her that. I found out later she'd noticed me mention weeks before that my mother used to cut it that way. She'd remembered a tiny detail I'd said once and never thought about again. I stared at the bowl for a long time before I could eat. I almost cried. She pretended not to notice and let me have that moment without making it bigger than it was. She gave me her bed and took the couch herself. When I tried to argue, she just turned off the light like the conversation was already over. Later, she took the photo out of my hands. She dried it off carefully with paper towels, one corner at a time, like it was something worth saving. The first morning, I woke up before Emma did. I folded the blanket on the couch into a perfect square, the way you fold something when you think you're only a guest. She found me doing it and laughed. "Guests don't make coffee," she said. The next morning, I made coffee before she woke up. She smiled when she found the pot already full. "See? You're already acting like you live here." I found out 2 years later, almost by accident, what she'd given up that first morning after she brought me home. She'd had a job interview scheduled that day, a position she'd wanted since college. She told me the alarm had gone off early. She'd laid her interview clothes out the night before, ready on the chair. But when the alarm rang, she looked over and saw me still asleep on her couch, exhausted in a way sleep alone couldn't fix. She looked at the suit for a long moment. Then she quietly hung it back in the closet and made breakfast instead. She missed the interview on purpose. She never told anyone why. When she finally told me, I cried. She just laughed softly. "I married the better dream," she said. The man who had mocked her lowered his eyes for the first time. It didn't get easier right away. A week later, I stood in her doorway holding my suitcase again. This time, I had packed it myself. "I don't want your pity," I told her. "Good," she said, "because I brought you my spare key, not my sympathy." The teenage boy by the cooler wasn't looking at Emma anymore. He was looking at me. I stayed. But I kept that suitcase packed under her bed for months. One day I came home and it was gone. She had unpacked it without asking me. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I slept better that night than I had in years. Even the children had stopped playing in the sprinkler. That same week, she started leaving the porch light on every time it stormed. She still does it today. There was a widower who lived 3 doors down. The first year, Emma knocked on his door with a small cake. "My wife always used to bake chocolate," he told her quietly, almost like he felt bad saying it. "Then next year we'll make chocolate," Emma said. She did it the next year too, and the year after that. By the 5th year, he stopped thanking her. He just handed her a fork, like it had always been their tradition. One winter afternoon, I watched Emma load 2 grocery bags into the trunk of our car. "Who are those for?" I asked. She smiled. "Someone who's pretending they're not struggling." That evening, we left the bags on a porch 2 streets over and started walking back to the car. Before we reached it, the front door opened behind us. A little boy ran out and hugged the grocery bags before he even hugged his mother. Emma didn't say a word. She just started the engine and drove us home. She learned the names of every garbage collector on our street and used them every single week like they were old friends. I have my own habits, too. Coffee first, every morning. Then I kiss the scar above her lip before I leave for work. 25 years. I've never once missed a day. Every anniversary, we go to the same diner, same booth, same order. Every Sunday, it's just the 2 of us. For dinner, because she knows Sunday used to remind me how unwanted I felt. She has never said one mean thing about my brothers. "Let's never become people who stop loving," she always says. Nobody at the barbecue had touched their plates in a while. I looked around the yard before I kept going. "You see a scar," I said. "I see the woman who drove through a storm to find me." I let that sit for a second. "You see the woman who missed a job interview she wanted her whole life. I see the woman who still kisses me goodbye, even on the mornings she's angry at me." Another pause. "You asked why I didn't marry someone prettier. The truth is, I was too busy falling in love with the most beautiful heart I'd ever known." Emma just said, "I hope someone loves you the way he's loved me." That afternoon, back at home, Emma reached for her makeup remover, just out of habit. Her hand stopped halfway to her face. She smiled at her reflection. Then she switched off the bathroom light. Word about the barbecue spread slowly. One neighbor mentioned it to another over the fence. Someone else brought it up at the mailbox. By the second week, people who had never talked to Emma before were stopping by, like they'd always meant to get to know her. A little girl asked Emma to stand next to her in a class photo. "Because you're not scared to smile." The teenage boy from the barbecue started saying hi first instead of laughing. The widower waved at her from his porch before she even reached the sidewalk. Neighbors, who never used to talk, started saying hello to each other by name. Emma never tried to change that street. It just changed around her, one small moment at a time. Before we left for the next gathering, I paused in the hallway. I looked at the photograph Emma had saved all those years ago, the one she'd dried with paper towels at her kitchen table, now framed on our wall. 3 weeks later, we stood in front of a memory wall covered in notes people had written by hand. The widower stood quietly beside the note he'd written, like he was guarding it. The little girl with the birthmark ran up and hugged Emma before either of them said a word. The garbage collector showed up straight from work, still in his uniform, like he hadn't wanted to miss it. A young mother read her own note out loud, her voice shaking halfway through. "You taught my son what confidence looks like. You reminded me to forgive my sister. My husband finally called his brother again because of your story. Our daughter stopped hiding her birthmark. You made this street feel like home." At the very end was one last card. "Welcome home." I froze. Emma took my hand. None of these people knew those were the exact words she had whispered to me on the worst night of my life. "Then let's say them." "Again," an older neighbor said. Everyone did, together. "Welcome home." Later that night, someone knocked on our door. It was the teenage boy from the barbecue. He was soaked from a sudden rain, holding a bag over his shoulder. "My parents kicked me out tonight," he said. Then he noticed the porch light. "Your light was the only one still on." I smiled and looked at Emma. I didn't explain anything. She already knew. Emma opened the door all the way and said the exact same words she had said to me 25 years earlier. "Come home." The teenage boy stepped inside. Emma closed the door. Outside, the porch light stayed on. People spent 25 years looking at the scar on her face. I spent 25 years watching the love in her heart.